Hello, friends, and welcome to the October 7th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can get involved. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Outreach Director. Today's episode is brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas. And today we are being joined online by Reverend Mel Caraway, a retired elder in the United Methodist Church and long-term board member of Texas Impact. And I think it's safe to say, Mel, that you are someone who spent a lot of your retirement time and energy post-pulpit engaged in climate advocacy. Is that a fair way to phrase that?
That's what my wife would say.
All right. Fair enough. So we're talking today because you just returned from New York after attending the Climate Emergency Consultation, which was set to coincide with the opening of the United Nations General Assembly. So who organized that event and what was the purpose?
Well, the primary organizers were the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, ELCA, with some help from the Episcopal Church. But on the planning team for that conference were a number of other faith traditions, including Hindu, Baha'i, Buddhist, and Muslim, and Jewish. So it was a very diverse, interfaith, multi-faith consultation.
So it sounded like a lot of our friends were there, huh?
A number of our friends were there. There was a very strong representation from most of our denominational partners, as well as the national and a number of state interfaith power and light organizations as well.
So what stood out most to you about the event?
The diversity. It was such a diverse group who was there and involved in the planning, and hearing the perspectives on climate change from different faith perspectives, but also from those not in the United States, from overseas as well, was also very instructive in guiding us in our deliberations.
Now, Mel, I'm trying to think of a nice way to ask this, but I go to a lot of denominational gatherings and annual conferences and judicatory events, and typically the folks in the room are a lot closer to your age than my daughter's age. I think that's probably a fair way to say that. Were there a lot of young people in the room? I know we saw Greta all over TV, but were the young people leading this conversation?
The young people's meetings were primarily on the weekend prior to that.
Okay.
There was, I would say that there were, the average age probably was 40s. And so there were some younger people, but also some seasoned veterans as well. One of the highlights for me was during the opening session, we heard from two of the organizers of the New York Climate March over the weekend, two 17-year-old young women who were incredibly articulate, and the success of their event in New York City kind of staggered their imaginations as much as ours, because they had gotten a permit from the city for a gathering of 10,000 people, and they only had 318,000 attend.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's a big number, and certainly they have a vested interest in this issue, right?
Well, I think the other takeaway for me from this event was that we need to spend more time listening to other voices, but especially we need to listen to the voices of youth.
Absolutely, and they are speaking. The question is whether we and whether policymakers will be listening.
That's the key. Paying attention to their voices because they're very informed on the issues of climate change. They're very passionate, and they're very, very well spoken and informed.
So what does it look like if we are listening well? Do you have any suggestions about that?
I'm sorry?
What does it look like if we are listening well? How can we do that? What steps can we take to make sure that we're listening?
I think primarily the main thing for those of us who have been engaged in this work for a long time, those of us who are somewhat older and really have become jaded at the lack of inaction, is that we need to look at new ways of doing things. The young people are not constrained by what we've done in the past. They're looking at how they can approach the dilemmas that we face in the future. And just because we've done it one way doesn't mean that's always the best way. So
you attended a session on climate justice. What did you learn about in that session? What's the takeaway?
One of the really interesting things in our discussion is that we were a global group. We had speakers from indigenous Latin America. We had people participating who were Baha'i and Hindu from England. We had people of color from this country, from the NAACP. And the common theme is that we need to cast a new vision. One of the problems that especially the third world participants spoke to was that we may need to rethink how we phrase this. And instead of calling it climate justice, we may need to start calling it climate injustice, because it adversely affects people of color and people who are economically disadvantaged proportionately more than those of us in the developed and affluent world.
Yeah, so talk more about that. I feel like people who are in the climate realm, the climate justice or climate injustice realm, and think about this all the time, will understand what you're saying. But for folks who haven't been paying as close of attention, what do you mean by that? How does it impact marginalized communities more than maybe some of us in developed countries?
Well, I think, and I think this was addressed really in a couple of the other sessions as well, but one of the first that comes to mind is climate migration, and how deforestation, burning of forests for taking away the rainforest, all of these things taken together further impoverish already impoverished peoples and keep them locked into poverty worldwide. And so we're looking at solutions on how we can, work this out. But at the same time, we have to look at it not as a matter of bringing justice to them, but why it is injustice to them.
So one of the things I think it's important to stress is that this is not a future problem, right? That there are injustices happening right now.
Well, absolutely. They happen every day. And this is one of the issues that was brought up in yet another session, and that was the session on 2019 and beyond, which I thought was kind of interesting. But what they looked at was what is taking place now, but what will take place in the future, both from a climate disaster standpoint, as well as ways to mitigate climate change.
Were there any opportunities, you talked about listening earlier, were there any folks that shared stories about how this is impacting their communities that really stood out to you?
It was more not so much in the personal story telling, although there were people who were able to share personal stories, but most of them were, there weren't that many.
Right. Okay.
There was a lot of policy, there was more policy discussion, but especially how we as people of faith, and understand that when we were speaking as people of faith at this consultation, people of faith is very, very broadly defined, because there were people of all faiths there.
Cool. So what were your major takeaways from the session, and what do you hope people will do?
In the climate justice, I think we have to acknowledge that climate justice or injustice, however we define it, is not localized, it's global. It affects all people, rich and poor.
Right.
And more often than not, the wealthier inhabitants of the planet are the ones who are perpetuating the injustices, but it also affects them and their health as well.
So, so from the climate justice perspective, what do we hope people will do moving forward?
Well, I think we need to get people to speak out about the climate injustice that does exist. We have to reinforce people's understanding of the relationship between our planet and the climate itself. They're totally interrelated, and the future of our planet is related to the future of what happens with the climate. I think we also have to pay particular attention to those who are affected, those who are threatened, whether it's by rising waters in coastal areas, island areas, whether it's in the rainforest and deforestation, whatever the situation is that is impacting them, we need to pay greater attention to them and to their needs, and how we can help mitigate and bring them out of the unjust and disastrous situations that they're living under every day. I remember a number of years ago, we spent a lot of time with Texas Impact working on the injustice of the oil refineries down in Port Arthur with our initiative 15 years ago, and how to help begin mitigating that. But we need to listen to the voices, we need to formulate realistic plans, and then we need to speak out both from a policy standpoint, but especially from a faith standpoint, and talk about the immorality of actions which are causing climate change and injustice.
Was the main challenge for faith communities to have the conversation within their context, or did they have any other takeaways specifically for faith communities?
I think it was a dual conversation. Have the conversation within your own context, but also listen to other people and what their needs are, but also don't limit the conversation to people who are within your own faith community, but reach out across lines and work together. Because when you're limiting your response to your own faith community, you're not reaching out and developing the broad coalitions that are going to be necessary to implement movements of justice.
Right. And were there any specific policy recommendations that they were advocating for, or anything on the policy realm that people should know about?
It was more generalities. A lot of it was more in the area of we need to spend more time listening. We need to use those listening sessions with people who are impacted to help us create new solutions. We've got plenty of old solutions. I mean, we've got We've got COP20, the Paris Climate Accords. We've got Sustainable Development Goals. We've got Earth Day. We have all these things, but what else? Where do we go next? And I think that was the takeaway, is that while these exist, it's not working.
So B's favorite thing in the world, as you probably know, are the Talanoa Dialogues, which is an opportunity or a framework for listening. Did they talk about that at all? I know
in fact, no, we didn't.
Oh, no.
Talanoa did not come up.
Well, for those listening, you'll remember, or you might remember, that last year Texas Impact hosted a series of Talanoa Dialogues, which is a framework for bringing groups of people from diverse backgrounds together to listen to one another and to try to find creative solutions to community challenges. And so if you'd like more information on that, I'm sure B would love to visit with you about the Talanoa Dialogues. Anything else, Mel, that really stood out to you about the event, or that folks should know about?
Well, I think the main thing is that by and large, we were speaking more in generalities, and we weren't doing specific advocacy, taking advocacy positions or developing means of implementation. I was at a United Methodist Climate Summit this summer in Nashville, and we spent 3 days together, which is a little bit longer period of time than we had at this one-day consultation in New York. But during those 3 days in Nashville, we broke up into 6 different working groups, and each of those working groups is now developing long-range implementation. And so, for instance, I'm on the advocacy working group, and we have put together a calendar of the meeting dates for every state legislature. And we're going to be working with United Methodist in every state to set up advocacy days on climate in all 50 states. Nothing of that nature came out of this. There were no task groups set up for future implementation, which was a bit disappointing. I would have liked to have seen more emphasis given to how we move forward, rather than just saying we need to do this.
Yeah, but I hear you, and I also do think the message to listen is important, because I do think there are people who spend a lot of time and energy working on climate injustice. But I also think for the rest of folks, it's important to recognize that there are people who are being impacted by this right now in communities near us and around the world. And we, especially as communities of faith, need to do a better job of listening to those impacted voices. Because when we do, I think people will maybe shift and realize the importance of this important global issue. Anything else that you'd like to either bring up or shamelessly plug today?
Well, let's see. A couple of the other sessions, in addition to the climate justice, were the climate change session that our good friend John Hill was a part of.
We knew somebody in there, right? All right.
I knew somebody in there, and their emphasis was that it is everyone's moral responsibility and necessity to form new and strengthen existing alliances. So in other words, we need to not just, as I said earlier, stay in our own box, but we need to reach out to existing alliances and also look to create new alliances who are working on climate change. And they talked about the necessity of dealing with those affected by climate change from a pastoral standpoint. The imperative of educating everyone about people who are suffering from climate change, climate injustice, how they are losing their identity, they're losing their culture, and how these are real problems. And for us to deny that problem can never be a solution. And then, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the climate migration session was challenged. Their message was that they were challenging everyone present to speak the truth prophetically on this issue. Don't be taken in by climate deniers, by fake news, because when we do not speak out with a prophetic voice, it takes an emotional and spiritual toll on those who are affected. And they affirmed it is within all of our faith traditions to reach out, to welcome the stranger, and to act powerfully on their behalf. And as they said, we have the solutions, we just need the resources.
Yeah, it seems to me like the faith community should be well positioned to help lead on those conversations, especially those of us from global connectional denominations who can share the stories of their fellow believers from other parts of the world who are experiencing this need to migrate, right? Was there any conversation about that?
There was some in that session about the causes of migration based on climate, right, and how we need to respond to those causal factors rather than just condemning those who are migrating because they're different from ourselves.
So any other sessions you have some highlights from?
Well, I think I mentioned there was a session on climate emergency declarations, and those are vehicles for action, and they're not always used the way they should be, but if they're used effectively, they can be a very effective tool in mitigating some of the disasters, but a climate emergency declaration will not prevent a climate disaster.
Right. All right. Any other takeaways?
Ooh. It was a jam-packed session. Did have the opportunity to visit with a number of our partners during lunch and at other times, and it was. I thought it was a good consultation. As I said, I would have liked to have seen more substantive implementation provided, means for that. There did not seem to be as much discussion or planning for follow-up, although I realize a lot of these same people and same groups will be in Santiago, Chile in December for the next round of COP talks. And so hopefully more discussion in this realm will take place at that point in time.
Yeah, and so we'll certainly have more conversations on Weekly Witness, either leading up to, during, or after those talks in December. But anything else you'd like to shamelessly plug today, Mel?
Sure. A week from this Thursday, the EPA is having a hearing in Dallas on methane and their proposed regulation revisions, which are basically, and I'll be writing more about this and testifying, but I think a lot of what they're proposing is sacrificing the health and well-being of the people and the climate and our climate on the altar of corporate profits.
So for those people listening to the podcast at all different times, that's October 17th, right?
October 17th, it's going to be an all-day. It'll be at the Earl Cabell Federal Court Building in downtown Dallas. And if anybody's interested, I'll get the information to you. Well, in fact, I think B already has it on how to sign up if they would like to speak at that.
Yeah, so if you're listening, you can go ahead and email us at engagement@texasimpact.org, and we can pass that information along. Mel, thanks so much for spending the time going up to New York to be a part of these conversations and to report back to us today. It's certainly an important issue and one that we'll be talking about more as the weeks and months and years go along. This is not something that looks like it's going away as an issue anytime soon.
No, I really wanted to go to the UN on Monday and hear Greta Thunberg, but security was a little tight and I did not have credentials to get in. So that was not a possibility.
Yeah, she's certainly a rock star, but I think like you mentioned earlier, there are a ton of young people who are speaking out on this issue. And so I'd encourage congregations and faith groups to lift up some of those young voices on this issue of climate justice.
I'm a United Methodist Earthkeeper, and one of our fellow Earthkeepers said in response to her address to the United Nations that there was more theology in that than he's heard in quite a long time.
Yeah, I'll buy it. Sure. Well, Mel, thanks again for joining us today. We appreciate all of the work that you're doing on this important issue and for all of the things you're involved in. You're amazing.
Thanks for all you do with Weekly Witness and everything else you do, because I know you were up in Dallas teaching Sunday school yesterday.
I was. We had a really good time at First United Methodist Church and appreciated that invitation. It was good to be with him on World Communion Sunday talking about advocacy and immigration and life. So thanks. Enough thank yous. I think that does it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we'll look forward to bringing you another edition of Weekly Witness next week. Until then, remember to share this content with your friends, rate, review, subscribe, leave a comment in whatever podcast app you are using so even more people can find this content so that we can create a movement of Texans of faith working for a more just Texas. If you have made it this far in the podcast, you clearly appreciate the work of Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community. So please make sure that you and your congregations are members. You can join by going to texasimpact.org/join. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, let's get to work.